The Baseball Writers Association of America are bad at picking MLB Hall of Famers. Every year they find a way to get it wrong. They seem to mess up in one of two ways. One, either not enough writers are voting for the clear Hall of Famer, or two, they completely overlook someone who is deserving of a Hall of Fame spot. It's frustrating to see it happen year in and year out, and it needs to change. The first problem is that way too many writers are not voting for clear Hall of Famers. By a clear Hall of Famer, I mean someone whose stats and awards are as good or better than some of their peers who are already in the Hall of Fame. Here are a few examples. In 2000, the BBWAA voted in Carlton Fisk and Tony Perez. It was Fisk's second year on the ballot after receiving 66.4% of the vote in the previous year. Fisk finished his major league career with the second most home runs for a catcher, first in runs, fourth in RBIs, third in steals, and first in games played. He won a Gold Glove in 1972, three Silver Sluggers in his career, and yet over one-third of the voters in 1999 opted to leave Fisk off of their Hall of Fame ballot. Granted, he was voted in his second year, but still only received 79.6% of the votes, being overlooked on 1 out of every 5 ballots. Did I mention that Fisk was also an All-Star 11 times? What more could he have done to get into the Hall in his first year? I'm genuinely curious. In 2003, catcher Gary Carter was voted in his sixth year on the ballot, receiving 78% of the votes. In his second year on the ballot, Carter received only 33.8% of the votes needed. Why did 45% of baseball writers have a change of heart between 1999 and 2003? 11-time All-Star, 3 Gold Gloves, 5 Silver Sluggers. He retired ranked 6th all-time among catchers for games played, 4th in home runs, 7th in runs, 5th in RBIs, and is still 2nd all-time for F-WAR for a catcher. Why did it take 6 years for the writers to decide he was finally worthy? Next up, Jeff Bagwell. Gold Glove, 3-time Silver Slugger, MVP. Bagwell wasn't voted in until his 7th year on the ballot. 5th in F-WAR for first baseman, 4 spots higher than Eddie Murray, who got voted in his first year. Bagwell had the higher batting average, on-base percentage, and slugging percentage. Eddie Murray won 3 Gold Gloves and 3 Silver Sluggers, but no MVP. Both players are certainly deserving of the Hall. Why the inconsistency between two seemingly similar players' careers? Does it all come down to Murray having 500 home runs? If Murray is a first ballot Hall of Famer, Bagwell should have been also. Yet, there is a 44.5% difference between Bagwell's first year on the ballot and his Hall of Fame voting one. Bagwell's 86.2% in 2017 is ironically nearly identical to Murray's. Edgar Martinez toiled on the Hall of Fame ballots for an entire decade before finally being enshrined into the Hall of Fame in 2019, where he received 85.4% of the vote. Martinez floated around 35% for a few years on the ballot before reaching a low of 25.2% in 2014. In 2016, his vote total jumped to 43%. In 2017, 58.6%. That's a 60.2% difference between 2019 and 2014. Did 3 out of 5 writers really not think he was worthy of the Hall? And if so, what changed? What about the 10% of writers who voted for him in the first 4 ballots and then dropped him? Undoubtedly, they were part of the 85.3% of voters in 2019. If you voted for him, didn't vote for him, and then voted for him again, what criteria are you even using to pick your Hall of Famers? More importantly here is, why was David Ortiz a first ballot Hall of Famer this year with comparable numbers? Martinez had a higher walk percentage, a higher on-base percentage, batting average, comparable slugging, comparable WRC+, and a far higher WAR despite playing in 343 fewer games. Roberto Alomar received 90% of the vote in 2011 after narrowly missing election in 2010 with 73.7% of the vote. The same Alomar who had 10 Gold Gloves, 12 All-Star Game appearances, and 4 Silver Sluggers as arguably baseball's best second baseman for the 1990s. More than 1 in 4 writers in 2010 decided he wasn't worthy of being a first ballot Hall of Famer. Craig Biggio finished his career in 2007 third in home runs for a second baseman, first in runs, second in hits, first in doubles, first in hit by pitches. He was also ninth in RBIs, ninth in stolen bases, and seventh in walks. He finished his career with 4 Gold Gloves, 5 Silver Sluggers, and 7 All-Star appearances. Despite these stats, he was left off nearly 1 in 5 ballots in 2015. Mike Messina was voted into the Hall in 2019 after being on the ballot for 6 years. His first year, 2014, he received only 20.3% of the vote, being left off of 4 out of every 5 ballots. Fortunately, that number increased by 56.4% between 2019 and 2014. However, Tom Glavine received 91.9% of the votes in his first year on the ballot. A comparison between the two shows that Messina generally had as good or maybe even a better career than Glavine. Writers saw it differently, and Messina spent 5 more years on the ballot than a comparable pitcher from his own era. For Hall of Fame voting to be valid, there shouldn't be such a wide discrepancy between potential Hall of Famers with similar resumes. The second problem is the players who, for whatever reason, get completely overlooked by the baseball writers. Again, the standard I'll be using is that the players are comparable to a player who has already been voted into the Hall. First up, and the most obvious one in my opinion, is Scott Rowland. He's currently just failed to get the required 75% on this year's ballot, his 5th. His 8 Gold Gloves at third are behind only Mike Schmidt, Brooks Robinson, and Nolan Arenado. The first 2 are in the Hall, with Arenado surely joining them one day. Rowland also won a Silver Slugger and finished 4th in NL MVP voting in 2004. He's also 10th all-time for third baseman in Fangraphs WAR. It does seem that Rowland's eventually going to get in based on the 63.2% he received this year. However, hits aside, Rowland's numbers are generally ahead of first ballot Hall of Famer Paul Molitor. Rowland is ahead of Molitor in home runs, slugging, and WAR. And while Molitor does have 4 Silver Sluggers to Rowland's 1, Rowland has 8 Gold Gloves to Molitor's 0. Again, if Molitor's a first ballot Hall of Famer, which he is, Rowland shouldn't still be hoping to get in on year 6. Next up, Jim Edmonds. In 2016, Edmonds' first year on the ballot, he garnered only 2.5% of the vote and was removed from future lists. He won 8 Gold Gloves in his career, a Silver Slugger, and made 4 All-Star appearances. Here's Edmonds' stats when compared to Vlad Guerrero Sr., who received 71.7% of the vote in 2017 before getting 92.9% of the vote in 2018 for his Hall of Fame induction. 56 home runs and 300 RBIs separate them, but their on-base percentages are almost identical, same with slugging and WRC+. Edmonds has a higher WAR by 10, likely due to his skills on the defensive end. This is another example of 2 very similar players offensively with 2 completely different outcomes. The same points can be made in the cases of Kenny Lofton and Brian Giles. Again, if Vlad is used as the benchmark for a high vote-getting Hall of Famer, good enough to get nearly 93% of the votes, we can see another enormous discrepancy between players with similar numbers. Lofton received 3.2% of the vote, Brian Giles received 0 votes. My last example of an overlooked Hall of Famer is Keith Hernandez. Remember earlier when I mentioned Tony Perez getting in back in 2000? Time to do a little player comparison and see who has the advantage. When we look at home runs, Tony Perez has him crushed, 379 to 162. Batting average and on base, advantage Keith. Slugging, advantage Tony. And WRC plus, advantage Keith. Keith also has 2 silver sluggers to Tony's 0. On the defensive end, Hernandez and his 11 gold gloves are incomparable to Perez. Again, on the surface, with Perez and his 379 home runs and 7 All-Star game appearances, it might seem like it's an open and shut case. However, when we look closer, the two are very comparable players offensively, with Hernandez holding a giant edge defensively. Despite this, Keith Hernandez received only 5.1% of the votes needed in 1996, hovering around that mark until 2004, his ninth year, when he received only 4.3% of the vote and was dropped entirely from future ballots. To many people in baseball, the Hall of Fame is a sacred institution. It means something to make it into the Hall. It's a goal many people have chased since they were children. It's a serious responsibility to determine which players are deserving of the honor, and the writers should treat it as such. When Ken Griffey Jr. is left off of 3 ballots, or when all-time strikeout leader Nolan Ryan is left off of 1.2% of ballots, it's disrespectful to that sacred institution. Perhaps Griffey was left off of the ballots of New York Yankees writers because he famously said he would never play for them. If that's the case, individuals that petty and small shouldn't be given the privilege of helping to select future Hall of Famers. With that said, here are my ideas for how the Baseball Writers Association of America could improve on their Hall of Fame selections. 1. Public votes for accountability. When 3 people out of 440 chose not to vote for Ken Griffey Jr. to be in the Hall of Fame, there needs to be some accountability. If the writers chose to omit him because they don't feel he's worthy for being in the Hall, they're showing they don't have sufficient knowledge to be picking which players get in. If they omitted him out of spite, they're showing that they aren't mature enough to be objective with their picks. Either way, there's no benefit in keeping these kinds of people around. When you're able to select up to 10 players to vote in each year, there's absolutely no reason to omit a player of that caliber. Number 2, get rid of the pity vote. You see it every year. A 250 hitting journeyman gets a vote from some writer who likes an underdog story. Or a guy who finished with 1,800 hits playing their whole career with one organization. I think there are plenty of good ways to honor someone for their 10-year MLB career. I just don't see why it needs to be a Hall of Fame vote. Number 3, a 1-year suspension if you don't vote for a player who gets 95% of the vote. I think we all have a good idea of which players are going to be around that number. It's not a perfect rule, but I think it could at least eliminate some of the writers who don't pick a player for reasons that clearly have nothing to do with the talent and resume of the player. Well, that's it. If you stuck around this far, thanks for hearing me out. What do you guys think? Are there any other guys you feel that deserve to be in the Hall of Fame that I missed? Let me know in the comments and let's get a discussion going.